Forget everything you think you know about dashing rogues and clever heists. Tonight, we are not walking in the footsteps of heroes. We are not celebrating cunning minds or daring adventurers. Instead, we are slipping into the worn-out, mud-caked shoes of the forgotten, the desperate, the invisible. We are stepping into a world where a single, stolen loaf of bread could cost you more than just your freedom. It could cost you your face, your name, your very place in the world. This isn't a story of glorious rebellion or a thrilling pursuit of riches. It is a story of raw desperation, of clinging to life in the dirt, and of the grim, grinding reality of survival when society has already cast you out. So, find your most comfortable spot. Let the demands and noises of the modern world fade away like a distant torchlight sputtering out in the rain. Allow your breath to slow and journey with me. First, we will tread softly into the muddy, treacherous, and deeply shadowed streets of medieval Europe, to feel the cold fear of a thief in the night. And then, when that chill has settled deep in your bones, we will travel forward in time, stepping into the chilling, unnervingly silent, and deceptively beautiful halls of the Victorian asylum. In the damp, cold, and often unforgiving twilight of medieval Europe, the path to becoming a thief was not paved with greed, but with despair. No child, huddled by a smoky fire, ever dreamed of a life of pilfering. The dream was simpler, and far more elusive. A full belly, a warm cloak, a life free from the gnawing ache of constant hunger. To understand the thief, you must first walk a mile in the peasant's shoes made of rough, worn leather that did little to keep out the perpetual damp. Imagine a life lived hand to mouth, where the hand was calloused raw and often frostbitten from field work, and the mouth knew only the monotonous taste of thin barley soup, gritty dark bread, and occasionally, if you were lucky, a bit of cheese. Your world was a small, tightly knit village, a patchwork of muddy lanes and waterland daub huts, all huddled in the shadow of a stone church and the Lord's manor you might never enter. You worked land you did not own, for a lord you rarely saw, but whose presence was felt in every tax, every demand, every restriction placed upon your life. The economy, for you, was not a system of opportunity. It was a relentless machine of extraction. When the harvest failed from too much rain or not enough, it wasn't a distant headline. It was the terrifying, hollow emptiness in your children's bellies. A silence at the dinner table that was louder than any scream. When a plague swept through the village livestock, it was the abrupt end of your only source of milk, wool, or the small comforts of a living creature nearby. And then there were the taxes, an endless, inventive, and crushing stream of them. Taxes on your meager crops, taxes on the birth of a new lamb, taxes to fund the Lord's distant, incomprehensible war, taxes to pay for his daughter's lavish wedding feast, a feast you could only imagine in your wildest, hungriest dreams. One day, the Lord's reeve, a man whose face was a permanent mask of bored indifference, would ride into the village, his horse trampling the mud, and announce that your last chicken, the one you'd been saving for a special occasion, was now a tax payment. He wouldn't ask, he would inform. In that moment, what do? The options were stark and brutal. You could beg, joining the legions of the destitute who lined the roads leading to the towns, their faces hollowed out by starvation, their dignity eroding with each passing traveler who tossed them a coin or a curse. Or you could fight back. In the only way available to you, you could start borrowing things permanently. The decision was never made in a flash of rebellious anger. It was a slow burn, a conclusion reached in the suffocating blackness of the night. It was made while listening to the sound of a loved one's wet, persistent cough. Knowing there was no money for the village herbalist, it was made while staring at your last small sack of mildewed grain, doing the impossible math of making it last through a long, cruel winter. So, finally, you commit. You find a scrap of dark cloth to tie over your face, not to create an aura of mystery, but simply to hide your identity from the neighbors who had known you your whole life, and who would surely turn you in for the smallest reward. You slip out of your hut, and with a heart pounding a frantic rhythm against your ribs, you melt into the shadows. You are now a thief. But here, in the cold and silent dark, you learn the first, soul-crushing lesson of this new, desperate trade. Almost nobody had anything worth stealing. The average peasant's home, your first and most accessible target, was a treasure box of poverty. You could risk everything life and limb to jimmy open a crude wooden shutter, past the sleeping family huddled together on a straw-stuffed mattress for warmth, their snores and murmurs filling the small space. And what would you find? Your grand prize might be a single wooden bowl, a couple of mismatched spoons carved from bone, and perhaps, if your luck was truly in, a wedge of hard, salty cheese wrapped in a piece of linen. The risk was the gallows. The reward was a meager snack. Perhaps you aim higher. The merchants passing through, they had coins. Yes, but they were worldly and suspicious. They traveled in armed groups, their pack horses laden with goods, and they slept in shifts at the local inn, their money pouches clutched tightly in their hands or tied to their wrists. To approach them was to invite a swift knife in the dark. The church, then, a truly tempting target, with its gleaming silver chalices, its velvet altar cloths, and the wooden collection box that held the villagers' precious pennies. But to steal from God was a crime of a different magnitude. It brought not just the law down upon you, but the terrifying, paralyzing fear of eternal damnation, a fear that was as real to a medieval mind as the cold ground beneath your feet. And more practically, it brought the instantaneous, righteous wrath of the entire community. Steal from a lord, and you're a criminal. Steal from the church, and you're a monster, a soulless fiend. It was a life of impossibly high stakes and laughably low rewards. A constant, desperate gamble where the best-case scenario was simply living to feel the agonizing pang of hunger again tomorrow. To be a thief is to become a creature of the night. But the medieval night was an entity unto itself, a profound, suffocating blackness that felt almost liquid in its density. There were no streetlights, no comforting glow from rows of windows, only the occasional, lonely torch flickering outside a tavern, casting dancing, distorted shadows, or the distant, cold light of the moon. If the clouds permitted, This darkness was both your cloak and your cage. It could hide you from prying eyes, but it could also hide a treacherous patch of ice, a broken cart left in the lane, a sleeping pig that would squeal bloody murder if disturbed, or a sudden, ankle-breaking drop in the path. Every single step was a gamble, a negotiation with the unseen world. And in this profound darkness, other senses reigned supreme. The dominant sense for a thief wasn't sight, but smell, and unfortunately for you, it was everyone else's dominant sense too. Hygiene was a concept reserved for the very wealthy and the clergy. For a thief whose bed was a hayloft, a damp alleyway behind the butcher shop, or a huddle of rags under a bridge, bathing was a forgotten luxury. Your clothes, likely your only set, became a pungent map of your recent activities. The sharp, lingering scent of the fish stall, the acrid chemical smell of the tannery, the earthy, unmistakable aroma of the pigsty. You didn't just smell bad, you smelled of crime. You were a walking olfactory crime scene. Guards didn't need highly trained bloodhounds to track you. They could just stand downwind and follow the faint, tragic trail of sweat, old fear, mud, and bad life choices. A sudden shift in the breeze could betray your presence from 50 paces away, your scent arriving long before your footsteps. Your other great nemesis, an even more immediate threat, was the dog. Every village, farmstead, and tavern had one, and these were not the friendly, tail-wagging companions we know today. These were wiry, half-feral, perpetually hungry creatures with names like Gnasher, Ripper, or Bitey. They served as the village's low-cost, high-aggression, and utterly loyal security system. They were furry, four-legged snitches with yellowed teeth and a deep, instinctual hatred of anyone who didn't belong. Their hearing was uncanny, capable of picking up the snap of a twig from across a courtyard. Their sense of smell was a supernatural tool of detection that could pass your unique scent of fear and desperation from the background smells of the night. You could hold your breath, walk on the balls of your feet, and move with the grace of a phantom, but the dog would know. A low, guttural growl would begin in its chest, a vibration you could almost feel in the air, before escalating into a frantic, hysterical barking that sliced through the night's heavy silence like a razor. And then, the inevitable would happen. A single light would appear in a window, then another. A door would creak open, a gruff voice would shout into the darkness. Suddenly, the whole town would be awake, and your simple, desperate mission to liberate a wheel of cheese had transformed into a frantic, heart-pounding flight for your very life. But let's say, through some miracle, you got past the smell and the dogs. You reach a door, you see no lock and think, easy pickings. You would be profoundly wrong. While formal, complex metal locks were a rarity reserved for nobles and the church, peasants were ingenious masters of low-tech, malicious security. It began with the door itself, a heavy, ill-fitting slab of wood that groaned and shrieked on its leather or crude iron hinges like a soul in torment. Trying to open it quietly was impossible. Then came the booby traps, tailored to each household, a string of dry goods, shells, or crude metal bells tied just inside the door, designed to rattle and clang with the slightest movement. A bucket of questionable, foul-smelling liquid, yesterday's dishwater, or worse, balanced precariously on a ledge overhead, and inside, a floor deliberately scattered with dry leaves, nutshells, and twigs that crunched and crackled with a sound louder than a thunderclap in the dead of night. And if, by some stroke of impossible luck, you made it past all of that, congratulations. You now had to face the final boss of peasant home security, the family goose. Geese were the medieval equivalent of a motion-detecting, flesh-pecking, emotionally unhinged car alarm with a personal vendetta against everything that moved. They didn't just honk, they charged, with a terrifying hiss that seemed to come from the depths of hell. They would launch themselves at you, wings beating like war drums, neck outstretched, beak open and ready to inflict a series of painful, bloody wounds. Many a thief's clandestine career was ended not by a knight's gleaming sword, but by the furious, righteous hissing of a territorial goose in the dark. Let us say your luck finally runs out. A tripwire you didn't see, a dog that was too quick, a neighbor who was a lighter sleeper than you anticipated. Getting caught was where the true, waking nightmare began. Medieval justice was not a system of inquiry, it was a performance of retribution, designed to be public, brutal, and unforgettable. Forget the notion of a fair trial with a defense lawyer and a jury of your peers. Your trial was often the hue and cry itself the moment a victim shouted, "Stop, thief!" The entire community was legally obligated by custom and law to drop whatever they were doing and join the chase. Your guilt was often assumed the moment you started running. If caught, your fate was not in the hands of a rogue judge, but in the hands of a furious mob of your neighbors, armed with pitchforks, clubs, farming tools, and deeply held, uncomplicated opinions about property rights. If you were lucky, a word that feels absurd in this context, and the crime was deemed minor. Perhaps the theft of an apple or a small piece of cloth. You'd end up in the stocks or the pillory. This wasn't a simple timeout. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of civic theater, a festival of public humiliation. And you were the unwilling star performer. You would be marched to the town square, the hub of village life, and locked into a heavy, splintery wooden frame that held your ankles, and sometimes your wrists and neck, in an agonizingly uncomfortable position, and there you would sit, a living target. People didn't just mock you, they were encouraged to participate. It was a community bonding activity, built on your misery. They threw things, not just words, but physical objects, rotten vegetables that splattered against your face, slimy fish heads from the market, handfuls of mud and animal dung, sharp-edged rocks that could cut and bruise. Children, with the casual cruelty of the young, would find it a grand game, jeering and poking you with sticks. Respectable citizens, on their way to church or market, would spit in your direction, their faces a mask of righteous disgust. You were exposed to the elements for hours, sometimes for days on end, the blistering sun cooking your skin, the freezing rain soaking you to the bone, the biting wind chafing your raw flesh. It was a slow, agonizing process of being publicly stripped of your humanity, turned from a person with a name and a story into an object of communal scorn. a lesson for all to see. But that was for first-timers, for the petty and the foolish, for a repeat offender, or for a thief who had graduated to more serious crimes. The punishments became permanent and personal. The justice system of the time believed shame should be portable, a mark you could never wash off. Branding was a popular choice. The local blacksmith, a man whose hands were strong enough to shape iron, would be tasked with reshaping your identity. He would heat a specially made iron in his forge until it glowed a terrifying cherry red. Then, held down by constables, you would feel the unimaginable searing heat as the letter T for thief, or V for vagabond, was pressed deep into the flesh of your cheek or forehead. The sizzle of your own skin, the acrid smell of it burning, was a sensory horror that would haunt your nightmares for the rest of your life. But the physical pain, immense as it was, would eventually fade. The true punishment was the mark itself. It was a portable prison, a lifelong, public announcement that read, "I am not to be trusted. I am other. I am less." With a brand on your face, you could never find honest work. You could never be welcomed in a new town where you hope to start over. You could never look someone in the eye without seeing your own shame reflected back at you. You were an outcast for life. And for the unluckiest thieves, for those who stole something of significant value, like a horse or a nobleman's sword, or for those caught breaking into a home, the final stop on this grim journey was the gallows. Executions were not quiet, somber affairs. They were major public spectacles, often held on market days to ensure the largest possible audience. A grim procession would lead you from the local jail through the crowded town streets. A priest might walk beside you, murmuring prayers that were all but drowned out by the jeering, shouting, and excitement of the crowd. This was entertainment. The executioner was not some hooded monster, but a well-known local figure, a professional, a craftsman of death who knew his ropes and knots with grim expertise. There was no dignity, no solemn final words offered to the condemned, just a rough, coarse rope scratching against your neck, a rickety wooden platform beneath your feet, and then the terrifying, stomach-lurching, final drop into nothingness. And even in death, the humiliation might not be over. Your body could be left to hang for days, sometimes weeks, picked at by crows. A gruesome, rotting scarecrow serving as a stark and constant warning to anyone else who might consider a life of crime. All of this for a stolen chicken, a desperate act of hunger, a single bad decision. It was a life where the gamble was everything. And the house, with its branding irons and gallows, always won. If you thought the rough, brutal, and public justice of the Middle Ages was the peak of human cruelty, let us now travel forward in time. We move out of the darkness of superstition and into an age of supposed enlightenment, an age of scientific reason, industrial progress, and unwavering belief in order and control. Let us step away from the gallows and into a place that was built not to punish a crime of the hands, but a perceived crime of the mind, the Victorian asylum. And as we will soon discover, sometimes the most terrifying cages are not built of wood and iron, but of good intentions, twisted into a new and silent form of horror. The Victorian asylum was born from a flicker of genuine, noble intention. It emerged from a society growing uncomfortable with its own past. A society that looked back at the medieval practice of chaining the mentally ill in dank cellars or leaving them to the cruel mercy of the streets and decided, we can do better. Reformers, philanthropists, and doctors championed a new, scientific approach, moral treatment. The idea was to create a sanctuary, a place of peace and order where a troubled mind could heal from the outside. These institutions were monuments to this progressive ideal. They were grand, often beautiful, Gothic or Italianate buildings of sturdy brick and stone, set within acres of meticulously manicured gardens and rolling parkland. They were given gentle, hopeful names like asylums, retreats, or hospitals, names that suggested rest, peace, and sanctuary. This architectural beauty was a deliberate and deeply effective. Why? In reality, they became warehouses for the unwanted, gilded cages for the inconvenient, and tombs for the forgotten. Who was considered mad? In the age of Victorian certainty, the definition was terrifyingly, maliciously broad, and it often had less to do with medical science than with social control. Of course, the asylums housed those with severe mental illnesses we would recognize today: schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder. But the asylum's heavy doors swung open for a vast and varied population of society's outcasts. It became a convenient dumping ground for alcoholics whose families could no longer cope, for epileptics whose seizures were seen as grotesque and frightening, for the elderly poor suffering from what we now call dementia, and for unmarried mothers who had brought the ultimate shame upon their families. Most disturbingly, the asylum became a weapon used to enforce the rigid, suffocating social conformity of the era. Men who failed in business, who couldn't hold a job, or who simply possessed a melancholic or rebellious spirit were diagnosed with moral insanity, a catch-all term for anyone who didn't fit the mold of a hard-working, stoic Victorian gentleman. And women. Women were especially and tragically vulnerable. The diagnosis of female hysteria became a medical cudgel used to beat down any woman who dared to defy the narrow ideals of feminine behavior. Did you have strong opinions and a desire to learn? Hysteria. Did you express or even possess sexual desire outside the bounds of marital duty? Hysteria. Did you suffer from the crushing weight of postpartum depression after a traumatic birth? That, too, was hysteria. A husband could have his wife committed with a chilling and bureaucratic ease. All it took were two signatures from doctors, often friends of the husband, paid for their convenient diagnosis, and a vague, unprovable claim of erratic behavior or nervous temperament. There was no trial, no defense, no appeal. Your life could be signed away over a cup of tea. Even reading novels was officially listed in some medical texts as a potential cause of insanity in women, as it was believed to overstimulate their naturally fragile minds and fill their heads with romantic, rebellious notions. In an age where divorce was a ruinous public scandal, locking away a troublesome, intelligent, or defiant spouse was clean, quiet, and perfectly legal. You didn't leave your family. You simply vanished from society. Your absence explained away in hushed, pitying tones. Once you were inside, the noble goal of healing was almost immediately forgotten, replaced by the more practical and far cheaper goal of management and control. The treatments were instruments of discipline and punishment, thinly disguised as medicine. Hydrotherapy was a favorite. It wasn't a relaxing spa treatment. It involved being strapped to a gurney and blasted with high-pressure jets of icy, shocking water, or being forcibly submerged in a cold bath for hours until your body went numb and your will was broken. The tranquilizer chair, invented by the esteemed Dr. Benjamin Rush, was a horrific device that strapped a patient in so completely they couldn't move a single muscle, their head often enclosed in a wooden box to block out all light and sound. The stated goal was to calm the senses. The real effect was total sensory deprivation, a form of torture designed to produce a docile, unresisting, and psychologically shattered patient. For those deemed overly excitable, there was the spinning chair, a seat that could be spun at high speeds until the patient became violently dizzy, nauseous, and eventually lost consciousness, a brutal method thought to reset the disordered brain. The asylum was not a hospital in any modern sense. It was a factory, and its product was broken spirits. The asylum building itself was an active participant in this process of dehumanization. A silent, stone and brick weapon designed for surveillance, submission, and the slow erosion of the self. The very architecture screamed control. Corridors were immensely long, straight, and starkly bare, often lined with polished tiles that amplified every sound. They were designed so that a single attendant, standing at one end, could observe a great distance with a single glance. The floors were hard and cold, turning every footstep, every sob, every distant, muffled shriek into an echoing, haunting symphony of misery. This acoustic design was intentional. It ensured that no sound went unheard, that privacy was an impossibility. Windows were tall and narrow, often barred, and always set high in the walls, letting in a cold, unforgiving light but offering no comforting view of the outside world, only a slice of indifferent sky. They were windows designed not to look out of, but to remind you that you were contained. The doors to the wards and cells were heavy, often made of thick oak reinforced with iron bands, and fitted with small, sliding observation hatches, known chillingly as Judas holes. They only locked from the outside. The sound of a heavy key turning in a well-oiled lock became the defying, rhythmic sound of a patient's life, a sound that meant isolation, the end of conversation, confinement, and the absolute, unquestionable power of others over your every move and every moment. Furniture, what little there was of it, was brutally functional and institutional. Heavy wooden benches were bolted to the floors of the day rooms. Beds were simple, unyielding iron frames with thin, straw-filled mattresses that rustled with every turn and often teemed with pests. There were no personal possessions allowed, no photographs of loved ones, no letters from home, no small trinkets that connected you to a former life. You were systematically stripped of your identity, reduced to a case number and a one-word diagnosis written on a chart at the end of your bed. Many of the larger asylums were built following the Panopticon design, A chillingly brilliant architectural concept, where a central guard tower could, in theory, see into every cell or ward. But the patients within could never know for sure if they were being watched at that exact moment. This created a state of perpetual, gnawing psychological anxiety, a constant feeling of being under observation that forced inmates to constantly police their own behavior, to suppress every impulse, to become their own jailers. It was a brilliant and exquisitely cruel form of mental enslavement. Even the designated outdoor spaces, the so-called airing courts, were little more than high-walled, open-air prisons. Here, patients would be marched in monotonous, silent circles for a prescribed amount of time, often segregated by gender and the perceived severity of their diagnosis. They walked under the cold, watchful, and often bored gaze of the attendants. This wasn't exercise for well-being or a moment of fresh air. It was a public display of absolute, soul-crushing institutional control. The daily routine was a suffocating, unvarying ritual governed by the clang of bells. A bell to wake you in the pre-dawn darkness, a bell for meager, tasteless meals of thin gruel and stale bread, eaten in silence, a bell that summoned you till hours of forced, mind-numbing labor, endless scrubbing of floors, polishing of brass fixtures, or sorting of laundry in the steaming, oppressive heat of the asylum's basement. All of it cynically rebranded as moral therapy. Then, a bell would signal hours of sitting in enforced silence on hard benches in the day room, forbidden to speak or interact. A bell for supper, and a final, definitive bell for lockup. The sound that sealed you into darkness for another long night. Any deviation from this rigid schedule a shouted word of protest, a refusal to eat the unpalatable food. A moment of uncontrolled tears was met with swift, predictable punishment. Isolation in a dark, padded cell where the only sound was your own breathing. Restraint in a canvas straitjacket for days on end, until your muscles atrophied and your mind blurred. Or another terrifying, therapeutic round of the spinning chair or the ice bath. Hope itself became a dangerous and diagnosable symptom. A patient who calmly and rationally insisted they were sane and deserved to leave would often have their medical file updated with a chillingly detached note. Patient suffers from grandiose delusions of persecution, lacks fundamental insight into their own condition. The system was designed to be perfectly, hermetically inescapable. The very act of resisting it was twisted into clinical proof that you truly and irrevocably belonged there. While men were most certainly victims of this cruel and dehumanizing system, the Victorian asylum reserved a special, insidious, and deeply personal kind of horror for women. It became a finely tuned and socially sanctioned instrument of patriarchal control, a convenient and chillingly quiet way to dispose of wives, daughters, and mothers who did not fit the suffocatingly narrow mold of the quiet, pious, submissive, and utterly domestic angel in the house. A woman's very biology, her entire life cycle, was weaponized against her by a male-dominated medical establishment. The profound emotional and psychological turmoil of postpartum depression was not met with compassion, but was dismissed as a form of temporary madness. Menopause, a natural and inevitable stage of life, was pathologized with the terrifying label climacteric insanity. A teenage girl's fiery, intellectual rebellion against her father's authority was not seen as a sign of a burgeoning spirit, but as a symptom of a moral sickness that required institutionalizing for her own good. The asylum, in essence, became society's attic, a dark, dusty, and forgotten place where inconvenient women were locked away, silenced, and systematically erased from public life. The famous and enduring literary trope of the madwoman in the attic, so powerfully rendered in novels like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, wasn't just a flight of Gothic fancy or a clever plot device. It was a grim, lived, and terrifyingly common reality for thousands upon thousands of women. They were not just stripped of their physical freedom, they were stripped of their voice, their credibility, and their very identity. Their stories were meticulously erased and rewritten in medical ledgers by male doctors and in legal documents by their husbands. Their legitimate pain, their righteous anger, their profound grief, all were dismissed as the irrational ramblings of a deluded mind. Their voices, when they found the strength to protest their unjust confinement, were quite literally silenced by heavy, stupefying doses of laudanum and chloral hydrate, and by the unyielding, soundproof finality of stone walls. In the end, the Victorian asylum stands as a chilling, monolithic monument to how easily the noblest of intentions, when mixed with the potent poisons of fear, unchecked power, and deep-seated social prejudice, can curdle and fester into a system of profound and methodical cruelty. It is a stark lesson that the most terrifying and inescapable prisons are not always constructed of iron bars and heavy locks, but of judgment, of power, and of the quiet, collective, and complicit decision to simply look away from the suffering of others. And even now, more than a century later, in the echoing silence of those long-abandoned halls, in the dust motes dancing in the faint light from the high, barred windows, in the peeling paint and the ghostly, empty corridors, you can almost still hear them, the whispers, the faint, sorrowful echoes of the countless lives that were trapped, broken, and forgotten inside. Their stories, lost to time but absorbed by the very walls that held them, remain a haunting, sorrowful murmur in the long, dark, and winding corridor of history.